in my opinion, the CIA killed Kennedy for that and for other crimes of trying to make peace. Maybe that explains the military-industrial complex as much as anything.
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs revealed his opinion regarding why JFK was actually murdered. This at a peace conference put on by the Ron Paul Institute. There's been many theories about JFK's death and so many lingering questions. So I felt like it was a good time to get the opinion of one of the best foreign policy historians in the world and best geopolitical analyst to weigh in on it. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Today, I was looking at all of the banner headlines about the failure yesterday in Alaska. The failure because we didn't launch World War III, because the two presidents had a good meeting together, because they announced progress. This is taken as failure in our media, which of course is hawkish by the moment and manipulated by, controlled by, paid by, or simply aligned with the military-industrial complex in the country. So it's extraordinarily hard to hear a word about peace in this country. It's not so complicated, actually, to end these conflicts. It's a little surprising how long it takes and how hard it is to accomplish this, but it's not so hard in substance, because the underlying reasons for the conflicts that the United States is in perpetually are not sound reasons from the point of view of America's interests, from the point of view of our security, from the point of view of our well-being or our economy. All of the conflicts that we are in and those that we could get in are misguided, misdirected, provoked by us to a very large extent, and solvable.
Yeah, how true was it when he said that they're greeting the story from Alaska as if it's disastrous because it might avert a war? Now, I'm not as optimistic about what came out of Alaska between Trump and Putin, but he's right about one thing. If you start wars, they'll make you president. But if you end a war, they're going to try to undermine you as president and undermine everything about you. That is the will and the purpose of the military-industrial complex, to keep these wars going forever, to keep the proxy wars going, money flowing into the coffers of Zelensky and Netanyahu forever. And he's right. If we actually had a traditional foreign policy built on the foundations that people like Jefferson and Washington prescribed, where we would have peace, commerce, and no entangling alliances, we'd have good relationships with other nations, that would be beneficial to Americans. So yeah, I'm with Sachs.
That's the basic point. It really is not so complicated. I think the wisest words, which we repeat, and Dan just started us with, that we've heard in the 80 years since the end of World War II, were those in President Eisenhower's farewell address on January 17th, 1961, and I'll just repeat them because they summarize all that has come to pass. He said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." This is a man who knew what he was talking about as the Supreme Allied Commander and as President of the United States, and I might add, as President of Columbia University, his most important job. He knew what he was talking about, and he was reporting to us a reality that existed already in January 1961. That reality almost led to the end of the world, actually, just a year and a half later in the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy experienced the full nearly catastrophic weight of the military-industrial complex at that time, because if President Kennedy had followed the overwhelming advice of absolutely almost every advisor in that ex-com that was famously preserved for history through its recordings of the days of that crisis, we would not be here today.
Yeah, I mean, we came darn close to nuclear war after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy, to his credit, solved that in a way that was conducive to the American public. It was conducive to actual America First values, is to de-escalate the situation. Don't try to escalate it further, even to the point of making a secret agreement where you're going to disarm missiles in Turkey to get these missiles off the coast of the United States. You know, that was good diplomacy, and that was done against the will of a lot of his advisors around the time. You know, also Eisenhower, that famous speech against the military-industrial complex, it was a fantastic speech. It's talked about often by people that, you know, really believe in non-interventionism and to kind of mind our own business. Eisenhower's record on foreign policy wasn't perfect. You know, he was involved in instigating the coups against the coups against Iran and Guatemala. And, you know, he wasn't perfect in any regard regarding foreign policy, but that warning is pretty prophetic. We do have a military-industrial complex now that steers the U.S. into war, regardless of the electoral outcomes, regardless of the rhetoric that's used, often, you know, a more dovish or non-interventionist foreign policy view, even when that's elevated by the populace through these elections. It doesn't always follow because this lobby remains. They're intrinsically incentivized to keep these wars going, to line their own pockets, the U.S. public be damned, and U.S. foreign policy be damned.
And I think people know, or you should know, that even after Kennedy and Khrushchev resolved the crisis through a kind of genius of decency and humanity against the advice of all of their military advisors, we nearly had the world end anyway because of a disabled Soviet submarine that was out of communication. And when it began, and it was in crisis, and when it began to surface, some jackass in the US military was dropping live hand grenades as a joke rather than depth charges. They thought they were under attack. And it happened to be the one submarine in the squadron that had nuclear tipped torpedoes, and they were entered into the bay. And a man named Mr. Arkhipov, who was senior to the captain, countermanded the order and saved the world, only to go back home, by the way, and be reprimanded and live in obscurity. But literally the man who saved the world within 1 second, because U.S. doctrine at the time was that any attack by a nuclear or atomic weapon would be met by the full force of the U.S. nuclear armaments, and the estimation at the time was 700 million dead across the Soviet Union, China.
Yeah, I'm glad he's pointing us out. This story about Arkhipov is really interesting, something that doesn't enter into political history very much. But Arkhipov may have saved the world, like he's saying. You know, it was because of his judgment that a nuclear war wasn't sparked between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's a name a lot of people need to know about because, you know, that's the sort of sensibility that I wish everyone had. Of course, our leaders don't have that. They're rolling the dice with our lives over these proxy wars, especially proxy wars with nuclear powers like the U.S. is now with Russia. That's what's going on.
Eastern Europe, but good reason to believe that all of humanity might have perished. And we came within a second of that. Next year, Kennedy made peace with the Soviet Union in one of the most brilliant and illustrative episodes of modern history. I commend everybody to listen to Kennedy's peace speech of June 10, 1963. My poor family has had to listen to it maybe 100 times. I wrote a book about it because I loved the speech so much. I was a friend also of Ted Sorensen, whom I admired enormously. But Kennedy made peace by praising the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, talking about their valor, their culture, their scientific accomplishments, and the fact that both sides would perish in a conflict, so both sides could be depended on to seek peace. And Khrushchev heard the speech, immediately summoned Kennedy's envoy, Averell Harriman, and said, "That's the finest speech by a modern American president. I want to make peace with your boss." And 5 weeks later, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed.
That's good foreign policy. That's what we need more of, for these Republican activists that act like it would be criminal to negotiate with Putin a peace. And there are some, a lot of Trump's base is in this regard correct. They do want good, positive diplomatic relations with Putin. A lot of them are still neocons that want us to be pushed to the brink of nuclear war instead. And it's just kind of ironic to me that even a lot of the neocons point to Ronald Reagan as one of their most their best intellectual forebears, one of their top influences in terms of politics and the presidency and foreign policy, and yet he was willing to meet with the head of the entity he called the evil empire. And that was Gorbachev. And because of their peaceable relations and with Thatcher, the Cold War came to a close. And now we're living in a new Cold War. And who's going to be on the right side of history? Well, the antecedents tell us the people that are good at diplomacy and stop fanning the flames and getting into all these proxy wars and these wars of choice that never pay dividends for the American public. They only plunge us into debt, ramp up the inflation, increase the potential through which our own civil liberties are violated. That's what the war on terror did anyway. The DHS and the Pentagon budgets expanding limitlessly. We got the Patriot Act. We got, the surveillance state. Everything to come from that has been evil and fortuitous.
And about 4 months after that, in my opinion, the CIA killed Kennedy. For that and for other crimes of trying to make peace. Maybe that explains the military-industrial complex as much as anything. Maybe our leaders are just afraid. They're afraid to make peace. They're afraid to step out of line. Maybe it is true, as some have said, that since John F. Kennedy, there hasn't been a president really that has been an independent actor in the American scene. I think it's an arguably correct point.
Wow, I mean, you can hear a pin drop while he's saying that, but nothing was better said from him on this entire clip, if you ask me. But yeah, I do think that's at the heart of it, is that even the elected representatives of the people, not only senators and congressmen, but presidents, feel that they're beholden to a higher entity that will come down on them hard like a hammer if they don't just continue to pursue the same ruinous foreign policy. And yeah, I think he's right there. That might explain the military-industrial complex more than anything and why it persists as a parasite that's eating away at the fabric that once made America, so respected in the world, relatively speaking. It was when we minded our own business, when we were the shining city on the hill, not because we tried to export our system of government to other places, but because we minded our own business and we generally kept the peace. Now, that wasn't always true. Even during the Monroe Doctrine era, we did get into wars with, Mexico, and you had the Spanish-American War. There were exceptions, but overall, we did not get bogged down in these stupid, perilous wars during those time frames.
Nixon is another partial example, and he may have paid the price as well by an inside job to help bring him down. I think it's arguable that they're just afraid. If they're not afraid of that, maybe they're afraid of Mossad, or maybe they're bought, or maybe they don't understand, or maybe they read the New York Times.
That's as likely as anything else, probably, but thankfully the Times' influence is dwindling profusely, quickly, and that's for the better. The rise of the independent media in itself is better. That's the best source of hope I think we have going for us right now. It's
a little hard to understand why it is that we are in this mess of war after war that cost trillions of dollars and that do nothing but worsen our security.
Yeah, I have to agree with him there. Man, I think he hit this speech on the head. This is the nail hit on the head with a hammer. Great speech by Sachs. It's as good of a point or as a perspective as I've heard regarding why Kennedy was actually murdered. You know, there's other things too that Kennedy did that didn't exactly rub the establishment the right way, like trying to prevent the Israelis from gaining nuclear weapons in the Domina project in the 1960s. There's a lot of documentation out there that showed that Kennedy tried to prevent the seizing of U.S. technology by the Israeli government to start a nuclear weapons program. That was the basis for the nuclear weapons program they have now. They're the only country in the world that has a secret nuclear weapons program that everyone knows about, but they won't admit. Why? There's a special carve out for them for some reason, and the U.S. just pretends like it's no big deal, even though they're supposed to be our greatest ally in the Middle East, even though it's their nuclear aptitude in the Middle East that seems to be creating a lot of problems there, combined with their propensity to attack their neighbors and commit a genocide in Gaza. But they went to war with the help of the United States against Iran, a country on the basis, ironically, that that country had a secret nuclear weapons program that they didn't authorize. You know, the irony and the hypocrisy here is striking, but JFK also pushed back against the Israel lobby in other regards. He tried to get the AZC, the American Zionist Council, that is the forerunner of AIPAC, that was what AIPAC was once called, to register under the FARA Act as a foreign entity, as a foreign lobby, much like every other foreign country has to do, that prevents them from having so much money and influence over U.S. politicians and U.S. bureaucrats, by the way, because AIPAC seems to wield that kind of authority over all types and all cross sections of America's ruling class and America's political class. And again, it was months later he was murdered. So there's many good reasons to think about why the CIA would be incentivized to take him out. We know because of the recent JFK file releases that, you know, the CIA was much more heavily involved with Oswald than was once thought. They had him under surveillance to an extent that we didn't know prior to those documents being released. In Mexico City, he had, you know, contacts over in the Soviet Union, and they had surveilled him. He was under a surveillance program, and there were ties to the CIA that people didn't know of before that release. You know, more came out of those files, but it's all these things adding up to the view that maybe he was the last real president that really tried to do something to buck the system. And was Kennedy perfect? No, he wasn't. Even after the Bay of Pigs, which he rightfully dismissed Allen Dulles for, you know, one of the arch villains of the 20th century, if you ask me, Allen Dulles, the architect of U.S. regime change operations, essentially, he did sign off on Operation Mongoose, and that was an operation covertly for the CIA to commit terrorist attacks against Cuba and, you know, try to overthrow their government clandestinely rather than overtly through the Bay of Pigs. But the Bay of Pigs was orchestrated not in a way to be successful, and that was why it was so criminal. It seems like the people in the CIA and Dulles that orchestrated it wanted it to just serve as the way through which deaths would happen, and then it was because of those deaths that Kennedy would then be willing to go full-bore regime change. Thankfully, he wasn't. That was a good idea, and we can point back to Kennedy generally as a good representative of American foreign policy. But I do want to hear from you. What is the real reason Kennedy was assassinated? Was the CIA involved? And do you agree with Jeffrey Sachs? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Judge Napolitano. Really appreciate his podcast and his appearance at this peace conference. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can get access to all my members only videos before they go live to the general public on my channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.